Picture a continent that, by modern standards, had almost nothing. No great libraries, no plumbing worth mentioning, no functioning bureaucracy to speak of. That was Western Europe in the final years of the 11th century. A patchwork of feuding lords, illiterate kings, and restless young men with swords and no future. Now picture that same continent, within the space of 3 years, throwing tens of thousands of its people across an entire sea and an entire desert, on foot, to capture a city almost none of them had ever seen. That is the story of the First Crusade, and it is, in almost every sense, a story.
To understand why so many Europeans marched into the unknown, you first need to understand how small their world actually was. In the 11th century, the true centers of wealth, science, and culture were not in Paris or London. They were in Baghdad, in Cairo, in Cordoba, and above all, in Constantinople, the ancient capital of what remained of the Roman Empire in the East. While European nobles were still largely unable to read, scholars in the Islamic world were translating and expanding upon the works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Galen. Constantinople itself was a marvel that no city in Latin Christendom could rival. A metropolis of hundreds of thousands of people, protected by walls that had stood for 700 years, filled with markets selling silk, spices, and goods from as far away as China. About desperation, dressed up as destiny. This is not a tale of noble knights on a clean and simple holy mission. It is a story about famine, about massacre, about a monk who claimed he spoke with God, about a spear that may or may not have been real, and about a city that fell to fewer than 15,000 starving survivors of an army that once numbered in the tens of thousands. It is also, whether we like it or not, one of the events that shaped the world we live in now, a word that still gets shouted across headlines 9 centuries later. Let's go back to the beginning, and let's go slowly, because almost nothing about this war unfolded the way anyone expected.
At the same time, the sacred geography of Christianity, Jerusalem above all, had been under Muslim rule since the year 637, more than 4 centuries by the time our story begins. For much of that period, this had not been a source of major conflict. Christian pilgrims traveled to the Holy Land under various Muslim rulers with relative safety, and the great shrines of the faith, above all the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built over the site Christians believed to be the tomb of Christ, remained standing and functioning. That changed in 1009, when the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakam, a ruler remembered by many later chroniclers as unstable and unpredictable, ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The building was torn down to its foundations. It would eventually be rebuilt, though in a far more modest form. But the shock of its destruction lingered in European memory for generations. For a society that already saw itself as embattled and pious, this was proof that the holiest site in the Christian world was vulnerable.
Western Europe, by contrast, was fragmented and poor. Feudalism had carved the land into thousands of competing lordships, each ruled by a noble who owed loose and often unreliable allegiance to a king. Trade routes to the wealth of the East ran through so many hands that by the time luxury goods reached a European court, they cost a fortune. And Europe had a particular homegrown problem: too many armed men with nothing productive to do. Under the system of primogeniture, when a noble died, his eldest son inherited the land, the title, and the income. Everyone else, the second sons, the third sons, the cousins, inherited very little. These younger sons had been trained since childhood for one profession: warfare. With no land to rule and no war to fight that offered any real prize, they turned their swords on each other, and often on the peasantry. The Church tried repeatedly to curb this violence through movements like the Peace of God and the Truce of God, which attempted to ban fighting on holy days or against unarmed clergy and civilians. These efforts had only limited success. Europe, in short, was a society sitting on a surplus of violence with nowhere for it to go. Then came a second, far larger disaster, this one military rather than symbolic. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, the armies of the Byzantine Empire suffered a catastrophic defeat against the Seljuk Turks, a dynasty of Central Asian nomads who had recently converted to Islam and built a powerful new empire stretching across Persia and into the Middle East. The Byzantine Emperor, Romanos IV Diogenes, was captured on the battlefield. Within a decade, the Seljuks had overrun most of Anatolia, territory that had been under Roman and then Byzantine control for over 1,000 years, and which supplied much of the empire's grain, taxes, and soldiers. For Byzantium, this was an existential wound. The empire did not collapse, but it was crippled, and for 20 years it lurched from one internal crisis to the next. Coups, civil wars, and the steady loss of territory on every front. Stability finally returned in 1081 with the rise of a shrewd and capable general, Alexios I Komnenos, who fought off invasions in the Balkans and slowly stabilized what remained of the empire's core. But recovering Anatolia, the empire's breadbasket?
So in 1095, Alexios did something that would set off a chain of events far beyond anything he intended. He sent envoys west to Pope Urban II, asking for military assistance. What he wanted, by every indication in the sources, was a contingent of professional Western soldiers, mercenaries essentially, fighting under Byzantine command to help push the Turks back out of Anatolia. He said nothing about Jerusalem. He said nothing about a holy war. He was asking quite simply for reinforcements. What he got back from Rome was something else entirely. Urban II, at the time Alexios' request reached him, was a pope with problems of his own. The papacy was locked in a long and bitter struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV over who had ultimate authority over the church, a dispute known to historians as the investiture controversy. Henry had installed a rival claimant, an anti-pope, and controlled Rome itself, which meant Urban could not even safely enter the city that was supposed to be. Alexios' appeal arrived at a useful moment. Urban was already looking for a cause that could unite the fractured nobility of Western Europe under papal rather than imperial leadership, and here was an opportunity handed to him almost by accident. On the 27th of November, 1095, at a church council held in the French town of Clermont, Urban stood before a large gathering of clergy and nobles and delivered what would become one of the most consequential speeches in European history. No transcript of his exact words survives. Every version we have was written down years later, often by chroniclers eager to frame the events that followed as part of a grand providential story. But every account agrees on the essential shape of what he said and on the reaction it caused. The response, according to every source we have, was immediate and overwhelming. The crowd is said to have cried out, "Deus vult," God wills it, a phrase that would become the rallying cry of the entire movement. People began tearing strips of cloth from their own clothing on the spot, sewing them into the shape of a cross and pinning them to their tunics as a sign that they had taken the vow. What Urban had done, whether he fully grasped it in the moment or not, was revolutionary. Christian theology up to that point had never developed a true concept of holy war, in the sense of warfare that was not merely permitted, but actively righteous. Even soldiers who fought for a defensible cause were traditionally expected to perform penance for the killing they had done. Famously, the Norman soldiers who fought at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 were assigned penances by the church for the men they had killed, despite fighting in what was considered a just war. Urban's preaching at Clermont inverted this entirely. For the first time, killing in the right cause was not merely tolerated, it was sanctified. A man could march to Jerusalem, kill in the name of Christ, and arrive in the afterlife with a clean conscience and a clean soul.
Urban did not simply repeat Alexios' request for soldiers. He transformed it. He spoke of the suffering of Christians living under Muslim rule in the East. He spoke of the desecration of Christian holy sites. And then he made an offer that no medieval Christian, living in a culture saturated with fear of eternal damnation, could easily ignore. Anyone who took up arms and marched to liberate Jerusalem would receive what was called a plenary indulgence, a complete remission of the punishment owed for their sins. For a society that believed, almost without exception, in a literal hell and a very real system of penance, this was not a minor incentive. It was, in the minds of those who heard it, a guaranteed path to salvation, purchased not with money or years of penitential suffering, but with a single act of holy violence.
There was another layer to this appeal that is easy for modern audiences to miss. Medieval Christian culture, still living in the shadow of the recently passed year 1000, was saturated with apocalyptic expectation. According to a strand of biblical prophecy widely believed at the time, before the end of the world and the second coming of Christ, the Christian world would first be united under a single righteous king, and Jerusalem would be restored to Christian hands. Many of those who took the cross were not thinking of this campaign as an ordinary military expedition. They believed, sincerely, that by marching on Jerusalem, they were participating in the literal unfolding of biblical prophecy, that they were living and fighting inside the final chapters of Scripture itself. Urban set a departure date of the 15th of August, 1096, the Feast of the Assumption, giving the nobility roughly 9 months to raise money, gather supplies, and organize their households before setting out. This was meant to be an organized, disciplined campaign, led by trained knights.
Months before Urban's official departure date arrived, an itinerant preacher known to history as Peter the Hermit began traveling through France and the Rhineland, delivering his own version of the call to arms. Peter claimed to have received a direct vision from Christ, instructing him to lead the faithful to Jerusalem, and he carried with him what he described as a letter sent down from heaven itself as proof of his mission. Whether Peter had genuinely visited the Holy Land before this, as some later accounts claimed, remains disputed among historians, but his audiences did not particularly care about verification. His preaching had an electrifying effect. Tens of thousands of ordinary people answered his call, not trained knights, but peasants, artisans, the poor, women, children, and a smattering of minor nobility, along with a fair number of outright criminals looking for a fresh start or an escape from justice. They had almost no military training, no meaningful supply lines, no maps, and very little money. What they had was conviction, and the belief that God himself would provide.
The violence began before this so-called People's Crusade had even left Christian Europe. Moving through the Rhineland region of Germany, several bands of Crusaders turned on local Jewish communities in cities including Speyer, Worms, Mainz, and Cologne. The logic that drove these massacres was as simple as it was horrifying. If the goal was to fight the perceived enemies of Christ, why march 3,000 miles to find them, when, in the eyes of the mob, they lived right there in the neighboring quarter? Thousands of Jews were killed in this wave of violence. Some communities were offered a choice between forced baptism and death. A significant number chose death rather than renounce their faith. Historians generally regard this as the worst organized violence against Jewish communities in Europe up to that point in history, and it established a grim template that would resurface again and again in the centuries that followed.
As the People's Crusade pushed further east into Hungary and the Balkans, the chaos only deepened. Groups of crusaders clashed repeatedly with local populations over food, plunder, and simple misunderstandings. In one infamous episode, a dispute that began over something as trivial as a pair of shoes escalated into open violence, and a crusader mob is reported to have killed thousands of Hungarian civilians in reprisal for an earlier skirmish. The Hungarian king mobilized his own forces in response, and several contingents of the People's Crusade were effectively destroyed before they ever reached Byzantine territory. Those who did make it to Constantinople presented Emperor Alexios with a problem he had never asked for. He had requested a disciplined force of professional soldiers. What arrived at his gates was an unarmed, half-starving mass of civilians who promptly began looting the outskirts of his own capital for food. Eager to be rid of them, Alexios ferried the People's Crusade across the Bosphorus and into Anatolia, directly into territory controlled by the Seljuk Turks.
The result was a slaughter. At the fortress of Zaragordon, a detachment of several thousand crusaders seized the stronghold, only to discover it had no reliable water source. Surrounded and besieged by Turkish forces, they held out for over a week under conditions of extreme thirst before finally surrendering. Those who agreed to convert to Islam were enslaved, and those who refused were killed. The main body of the People's Crusade, numbering perhaps 20,000, marched further into Anatolia and walked directly into a Turkish ambush. The organized Seljuk cavalry annihilated them almost completely.
Only a small fraction of the original force escaped back to the coast. Peter the Hermit himself survived, having been away from the main army negotiating supplies with Alexios at the time of the disaster. He would go on to join the official crusading army as though nothing had happened. By the time it was over, the People's Crusade had achieved nothing militarily. It had cost the lives of thousands of European Jews, thousands of Hungarian civilians, and tens of thousands of its own participants, while the Seljuk Turks, who had lost comparatively few men, remained firmly in control of Anatolia, and Jerusalem stood exactly where it always had, 1,000 miles away and entirely untouched.
The crusade that Urban had actually intended, the organized, noble-led expedition, set out in the late summer and autumn of 1096. Unlike the disorganized mass that had preceded it, this was a coalition of several distinct armies, each commanded by a powerful regional lord, none of whom fully trusted the others. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, led a contingent from the Rhineland and Lorraine. He reportedly sold or mortgaged much of his own territory to finance the campaign. Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman warlord from southern Italy whose own father had led a failed invasion of Byzantine territory little more than a decade earlier, brought a formidable force of Italian Normans, along with his nephew Tancred. Raymond of Toulouse, the oldest and among the wealthiest of the crusading leaders, led a large force from southern France and clearly saw himself as the natural overall commander of the expedition. Several other significant lords joined them, including Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, and Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the king.
Together, these separate armies numbered somewhere between 50 and 70,000 people in total, including a corps of perhaps 5,000 mounted armored knights. By the military standards of the age, an extraordinarily powerful force. When the various contingents arrived at Constantinople, Alexios required each of their leaders to swear a formal oath. Any former Byzantine territory recaptured from the Turks would be returned to imperial control. This was, from Alexios' perspective, entirely reasonable. This had, after all, been his land only a generation or two earlier. But the crusading lords, many of whom had already sacrificed enormous personal wealth for this campaign, had little genuine interest in fighting to expand someone else's empire. Still, dependent on Byzantine supplies and logistical support to survive the journey ahead, one by one, the leaders swore the oath, with varying degrees of sincerity.
The Crusaders then crossed into Anatolia at a moment of real strategic opportunity. The Seljuk Sultanate controlling the region was fractured by internal rivalries and unprepared for a coordinated assault from a force of this size. At the Battle of Dorylaeum in the summer of 1097, the combined Crusader army decisively defeated a major Turkish force in open battle, one of the rare set-piece victories the Crusaders would achieve in a war otherwise dominated by sieges, ambushes, and attrition. Antioch was one of the great fortified cities of the ancient world, ringed by massive walls studded with hundreds of defensive towers, and its garrison had no intention of surrendering easily. The siege that followed lasted roughly 8 months, and it very nearly destroyed the entire crusading army, not through enemy action alone, but through simple, grinding starvation.
Trapped outside the walls with dwindling supply lines, the Crusaders were reduced to eating their own horses, then their pack animals, and eventually, according to several contemporary chroniclers, resorting to acts of desperation almost too grim to record in polite language. Disease spread rapidly through the crowded, filthy camp. Desertion became a nightly occurrence, with even some senior nobles slipping away rather than face what looked increasingly like a doomed campaign. The city finally fell in the summer of 1098, not through direct assault, but through betrayal. Bohemond of Taranto secretly negotiated with a disaffected officer inside Antioch's garrison, who agreed to open a postern gate to a single tower under cover of night. The Crusaders poured in and took the city, but almost immediately found themselves besieged in turn as a massive relief army sent by the Seljuk Atabeg of Mosul arrived and surrounded the city walls from the outside, trapping the Crusaders inside a city they had just stripped of its remaining food stores.
At this most desperate moment, an event occurred that, whatever its ultimate truth, would prove decisive for Crusader morale. A visionary named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received a series of revelations pointing to the exact location, buried beneath a church within Antioch, of the Holy Lance, the spear traditionally said to have pierced the side of Christ during the crucifixion. Diggers were sent to excavate the spot, and a piece of iron was duly found. Modern historians remain deeply divided over whether this was a genuine discovery, an honest mistake, or a calculated fabrication designed to save a starving, demoralized army from collapse. What mattered in the moment was the effect. Convinced they now carried a holy relic into battle, the Crusaders marched out of Antioch's gates and threw themselves at the besieging Turkish army in a desperate, near-suicidal charge. Against most expectations, the relief force broke and scattered. Antioch was saved, but
By the time the surviving Crusaders finally came within sight of Jerusalem in June of 1099, nearly 3 years had passed since Urban's sermon at Clermont. Of the tens of thousands who had originally set out, perhaps only 12 to 13,000 remained, including roughly 1,300 knights, a fraction of the original force, exhausted, dehydrated, and acutely aware that time was not on their side. The city's Fatimid governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, had used the months of warning to prepare a serious defense. He expelled the Christian population from within the city walls, removing any risk of an internal betrayal of the kind that had doomed Antioch. He had the wells outside the city poisoned or filled in, stockpiled grain and water within the walls, and stationed a cavalry force specifically to harass any Crusader foraging parties. He also knew that a large Egyptian relief army was already being mobilized and would eventually arrive to break the siege. All he needed to do was hold the walls until it did.
Jerusalem itself was a formidable natural and man-made fortress. Steep ravines protected its eastern and southern approaches, making a direct assault from those directions essentially impossible. The only viable approaches lay to the north and southwest, both heavily fortified with double walls and deep defensive ditches. The Crusader army, reduced as it was, could barely muster enough men to encircle even half the city's perimeter. An initial assault on the 13th of June ended badly. Without proper siege equipment, the surrounding hills had been stripped almost entirely bare of usable timber by the city's defenders. The Crusaders attempted to scale the walls with improvised ladders and raw determination. They briefly overran an outer ditch before being thrown back with heavy casualties. It was immediately clear that taking the city would require proper siege towers, battering rams, and catapults, none of which existed yet. On the 8th of July, in a moment of collective religious desperation, the Crusader leadership organized a barefoot procession around the entire circuit of the city walls, a deliberate reenactment of the biblical siege of Jericho, where scripture describes the walls falling at the sound of trumpets after a similar ritual march. The defenders, watching from the ramparts, are said to have jeered and mocked the spectacle. But whatever its effect on the walls of Jerusalem,
the ritual appears to have had a real effect on the Crusaders themselves. According to the chroniclers, the feuding leaders reconciled in its aftermath, and construction of the siege engines, which had proceeded at an agonizingly slow pace for weeks, suddenly accelerated dramatically, with every able body in the camp, reportedly even elderly women and children, pressed into hauling timber and stone. On the night of the 9th of July, Godfrey of Bouillon's forces carried out a piece of deception that would prove decisive. Having spent weeks conspicuously constructing a massive siege tower opposite one section of the northern wall, in full view of the defenders, who concentrated their reinforcements accordingly, Godfrey's men dismantled the entire structure overnight and rebuilt it before dawn at a different, more lightly defended stretch of wall. When the sun rose, Iftikhar ad-Daulah's garrison found the tower had effectively moved over.
Salvation, of a sort, arrived on the 17th of June, when a small fleet of Christian ships reached the nearby port of Jaffa, carrying food, rope, tools, and critically, skilled shipwrights and carpenters. When an Egyptian fleet moved to blockade the harbor, the crews stripped their own vessels down to bare timber and burned the hulls rather than let the ships fall into enemy hands. Even with this material, there was not nearly enough wood to build the equipment needed, and Crusader work parties were forced to travel dozens of miles north into forested territory, using local forced labor to haul the felled timber back to the siege lines. Conditions in the Crusader camp deteriorated badly through the following weeks. Water sources near Jerusalem had been deliberately fouled or destroyed, forcing soldiers to march considerable distances to fill water skins from the River Jordan. The Crusades' leadership, never fully unified to begin with, fell into open quarrels over who would ultimately govern Jerusalem if the siege succeeded. Morale collapsed further when scouts confirmed that the Egyptian relief army was drawing closer and would likely arrive within a month.